In the darkest moments of history, sometimes a small light appears. It is not a grand, blazing fire that burns away all evil. Instead, it is a small, determined flicker of hope. The Kindertransport was one such light. It was a lifeline thrown to children who were trapped in a rising tide of hatred and violence. Between 1938 and 1939, this incredible rescue mission brought nearly 10,000 children, most of them Jewish, to safety in Great Britain. They were saved from the horrors of the Nazi regime that were about to consume Europe. Their parents made the most difficult choice imaginable, sending their children away to a foreign land with the hope that they might live. This was not a government-led evacuation planned with military precision. It was a humanitarian effort, born from the conscience of ordinary people. It was a testament to what can be achieved when compassion overcomes bureaucracy and fear. Quakers, Jewish community leaders, Christian groups, and countless individuals came together. They saw the looming catastrophe and refused to stand by and do nothing. The story of the Kindertransport is not just about the children who were saved. It is also about the people who saved them. It is a story of incredible bravery, sacrifice, and the profound power of human kindness in the face of unimaginable cruelty. The journeys were filled with fear and uncertainty. Children, some too young to understand what was happening, carried small suitcases and wore identification tags around their necks. They said goodbye to their parents at crowded train stations, not knowing if they would ever see them again. For most, this farewell was final. They arrived in a new country with a different language and different customs. They were placed in the care of foster families, hostels, and schools across the United Kingdom. While they were safe from the physical dangers of the war, they carried the emotional scars of separation and loss for the rest of their lives. Looking back from today, October 29th, 2025, the Kindertransport feels like a miracle. It stands as a powerful symbol of what is possible when a nation opens its heart and its borders. The children who were saved grew up to become doctors, artists, scientists, and leaders. They built new lives and contributed greatly to the country that gave them refuge. Their stories are a vital part of our shared history. They remind us of the promises we make when we say never again. They challenge us to look at the world around us and ask if we are living up to that promise. The legacy of the Kindertransport is a question as much as it is a memory. The night of November 9th to 10th, 1938, changed everything. Throughout Germany and Austria, the Nazi regime unleashed a brutal, organized wave of violence against Jewish people. This event became known as Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. Synagogues were burned to the ground. Jewish-owned businesses and homes were looted and destroyed. Thousands of Jewish men were arrested and sent to concentration camps. The streets were littered with shattered glass, but it was the illusion of safety that was truly broken. For years, the situation for Jewish people had been getting worse, but Kristallnacht made the terrible reality undeniable. The world could no longer look away. The news of the pogrom spread quickly across the globe, sparking outrage and horror. In Great Britain, the public response was one of deep shock and sympathy. A delegation of British, Jewish, and Quaker leaders met with the Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, and the Home Secretary, Sir Samuel Hoare. They pleaded for the government to take immediate action to help the Jewish people who were in such grave danger. They argued that something had to be done, especially for the children who were the most vulnerable. They proposed a radical idea to allow a large number of unaccompanied refugee children to enter the UK temporarily. This was not a simple request. At the time, Britain had strict immigration controls. The country was also facing economic difficulties and high unemployment. There was fear that accepting a large number of refugees would create social and economic problems. However, the moral pressure after Kristallnacht was immense. Sir Samuel Hoare was deeply moved by the reports he heard. On November 21, 1938, he announced in the House of Commons that the government would waive visa requirements for a certain number of unaccompanied children under the age of 17. It was a landmark decision, a crack in the wall of indifference. The government's agreement came with important conditions. The rescue operation had to be privately funded. The government would not provide any public money for the children's care or maintenance. Each child required a guarantee of £50 to be deposited to fund their eventual re-emigration after the crisis was over. No one knew then that for most, there would be no home or family to return to. The challenge was enormous. Organizers had to raise a huge amount of money and find homes for thousands of children in a very short time. The race against time had begun. With the British government's approval secured, a remarkable coalition of humanitarian groups sprang into action. This was not the work of a single organization, but a coordinated effort by many different people united by a common purpose. The British Jewish Refugee Committee took a leading role, working tirelessly to manage the complex logistics. They collaborated closely with Quaker organizations, such as the Society of Friends, whose members had a long history of pacifism and humanitarian aid. Christian groups, trade unions, and individuals from all walks of life joined the cause, offering money, time, and homes. The central organizing body in London was the Movement for the Care of Children from Germany, which later became the Refugee Children's Movement, or RCM. This group was the heart of the operation. Its volunteers worked around the clock, processing thousands of applications from desperate parents in Europe. They matched children with foster families or arranged places for them in hostels and schools. The work was overwhelming. They had to navigate a mountain of paperwork, coordinate travel, and ensure that every child had a safe place to go upon arrival. It was a frantic, desperate effort to save as many lives as possible before the borders closed for good. Funding the entire operation was a monumental task. The £50 guarantee required for each child was a very large sum of money in the 1930s. The RCM launched a public appeal for donations, and the British people responded with incredible generosity. People donated money, jewelry, and other valuables. Schools organized fundraisers and churches held special collections. Philanthropists made large contributions, but much of the funding came from small donations from ordinary citizens who were moved by the plight of the children. This collective effort demonstrated a deep well of compassion within British society, a willingness to help strangers in their hour of greatest need. Key figures emerged who dedicated themselves completely to the rescue. People like Rabbi Solomon Schonfeld used his own connections to organize several transports and personally brought hundreds of Orthodox Jewish children to Britain. Bertha Leverton, herself a Kindertransport refugee, would later become a crucial voice for survivors, founding the Kindertransport Association to connect former child refugees. These individuals, and many others whose names are not as well known, were the architects of mercy. They built a bridge from despair to hope, one child at a time. Their work stands as a powerful example of how individual action can change the course of history. While many people contributed to the Kindertransport from Germany and Austria, one man's story stands out for his extraordinary efforts in another country, Czechoslovakia. That man was Sir Nicholas Winton. In the winter of 1938, Winton was a 29-year-old stockbroker in London, preparing for a ski trip to Switzerland. Just before he was due to leave, he received a call from a friend involved in refugee work in Prague. His friend urged him to come to Czechoslovakia instead, saying, "I have a most interesting assignment for you. Don't bother to bring your skis." Winton cancelled his holiday and travelled to Prague, where he saw the desperate situation firsthand. What he found was thousands of families, refugees from the newly annexed Sudetenland, living in terrible conditions. They were freezing and starving, with no hope of escape. Winton knew that after Kristallnacht, the danger was immense. While organizations were helping adults, he realized that very little was being done to save the children. He decided he had to do something. Working from his hotel room, he set up his own makeshift rescue organization. He began compiling a list of children whose parents were desperate to get them to safety. He faced immense bureaucratic obstacles from multiple countries, but he refused to give up. Winton returned to London to manage the operation from there. He worked his day job at the stock exchange and then spent his evenings and weekends fighting for the children. He persuaded the British Home Office to allow the children in, even though the official Kindertransport program did not yet extend to Czechoslovakia. He had to find foster families and raise the required £50 guarantee for every single child. He placed advertisements in British newspapers and magazines, appealing for families to come forward. The response was incredible. Hundreds of British families offered to open their homes to a child they had never met. Between March and August of 1939, Nicholas Winton and his small team of volunteers successfully organized 8 trains that carried 669 children from Prague to London. A 9th train, with 250 children on board, was scheduled to leave on September 1st, 1939. That was the day that Germany invaded Poland, and the war began. The train never left the station. All of the children on that final transport are believed to have perished in the Holocaust. For the rest of his life, Winton was haunted by the fate of those children. For almost 50 years, he never spoke of his wartime heroism. The world only learned of his actions in 1988, when his wife found a scrapbook in their attic containing the lists of all the children he had saved. The journey itself was, well, a defining experience for every Kindertransport child. It began at a crowded, chaotic train station in Berlin, Vienna, or Prague. Parents who had been forced to make the most heart-wrenching decision of their lives tried to be brave for their children. They gave last-minute instructions, straightened collars, and whispered final words of love. Each child was allowed only one small suitcase containing a few practical items and perhaps a treasured photograph or toy. They wore a numbered tag around their necks for identification. As the train whistle blew, children pressed their faces against the windows, trying to catch one last glimpse of the parents they were leaving behind. The train ride across Germany was tense and frightening. The children traveled in sealed carriages, sometimes under the watch of Nazi guards. They were told not to speak or draw attention to themselves. The older children tried to comfort the younger ones, who were crying for their mothers and fathers. They passed through a landscape that was once their home, but had now become hostile and dangerous. The real moment of relief came when the train crossed the border into the Netherlands or Belgium. Here, they were often met by kind volunteers who gave them food, drink, and warm smiles. It was the first sign that they were heading towards safety. From the ports in Holland or Belgium, the children boarded ferries for the crossing to England. For many, it was their first time seeing the sea. The journey across the English Channel could be rough, and many children were seasick and exhausted. But as they approached the English coast, they felt a sense of hope. They arrived at ports like Harwich, where they were greeted by officials and volunteers. They were taken to temporary reception centres, such as a holiday camp at Dovercourt Bay. Here, they were registered, given a medical checkup, and provided with warm food and a place to sleep, often for the first time in days. The final stage of the journey was the dispersal. From the reception centres, children were sent to meet their new guardians. Some children were met at the station by their specific foster parents, who had chosen them from a photograph or a list. Others waited anxiously for someone to come and claim them. It was a strange and unsettling process, like being chosen from a lineup. They were then taken to their new homes, scattered all across the country. They arrived in a land where they did not speak the language, understand the food, or know the customs. They were safe, but they were also completely alone, starting a new life in a world that was entirely unknown. Upon arrival in Great Britain, the children of the Kindertransport began a new and often difficult chapter of their lives. They were scattered across the country, from large cities to small rural villages. Their experiences varied greatly depending on where they were placed. Many children were welcomed into the homes of foster families who treated them with great love and kindness. These families opened their hearts as well as their doors, providing a stable and nurturing environment. They helped the children learn English, navigate a new culture, and cope with their trauma and loss. For many children, these foster parents became their new family, and the bonds they formed lasted a lifetime. However, not all experiences were positive. Some children were placed in homes where they were not treated as part of the family, but more like domestic help. They were expected to work long hours and were given little affection. Others were moved from one foster home to another, never finding a sense of stability or belonging. A number of children were placed in hostels or group homes, which provided a more institutional setting. While these places offered safety and structure, they could also be lonely. The children had to adapt to a new country and a new life, while carrying the heavy burden of worry for the families they had left behind. The cultural adjustment was immense. The children had to learn a new language, get used to different food, and understand British customs that were completely foreign to them. Many of them had come from educated middle-class families in the cities of Europe, and they suddenly found themselves in very different environments, such as on farms or in working-class households. They missed their parents, their homes, and everything that was familiar to them. They often tried to hide their sadness and grief, not wanting to be a burden on their new caregivers. This created a deep, unspoken loneliness that many carried with them for years. When the war began in September 1939, the situation changed again. Mail service with Germany and occupied territories was cut off, severing the last link the children had with their parents. The silence was terrifying. Furthermore, some of the older children, particularly boys over the age of 16, were classified as enemy aliens by the British government. In a cruel twist of fate, these refugees who had fled Nazi persecution were rounded up and interned in camps. Some were even deported to camps in Canada or Australia. It was a confusing and frightening time, adding another layer of trauma to their experience of displacement and loss. When the war in Europe finally ended in 1945, the Kindertransport children were filled with a desperate hope. For years, they had been living in silence, unable to contact their families. Now, they waited anxiously for news. They wrote letters to their old addresses and sent inquiries through organizations like the Red Cross. They clung to the belief that their parents had survived and that they would soon be reunited. Slowly and painfully, the truth began to emerge. For the vast majority of the children, there would be no reunion. Their parents, along with their siblings, grandparents, and entire families, had been murdered in the Holocaust. The realization that they were now orphans was a devastating blow. The hope that had sustained them through the difficult war years was gone, replaced by an immense and empty grief. Most of the children were still teenagers at this point, and they had to face this terrible reality alone. They had lost not only their families, but also their entire past. Their homes were gone, their communities destroyed. Many of them never found out the exact details of how or where their parents had died. This lack of closure left a deep and permanent wound. The temporary refuge they had been given in Britain now became their permanent home. After the war, the survivors had to decide what to do with their lives. Many chose to remain in the United Kingdom, the country that had saved them. They became British citizens, built careers, and started their own families. Some were formally adopted by their foster parents, solidifying the bonds that had formed during the war. Others emigrated to start new lives in other countries, such as the United States, Canada, or the newly established State of Israel. They carried with them a complex identity, caught between the world they had lost and the world they had been forced to adopt. The trauma of their experience had a lifelong impact. Many survivors struggled with feelings of guilt, wondering why they had been saved when their families had not. they grappled with a profound sense of loss and displacement. In my play, Kindertransport, I explored this theme of a divided self, of how a child might feel the need to suppress their past in order to survive in the present. For many years, a lot of survivors did not speak about their experiences. It was too painful. It was only much later in life that they began to share their stories, ensuring that the world would never forget what they and their lost families had endured. The story of the Kindertransport is not just a piece of history, it is a living lesson that resonates powerfully today. When we look at the world in 2025, we see conflicts and persecution in places like Ukraine, Sudan, and many other regions, creating new generations of refugees. Once again, children are fleeing war, violence, and instability. They face perilous journeys in search of safety, often separated from their families. The echoes of the 1930s are unmistakable. The debate over how to respond to these crises is a central challenge for wealthy nations today, just as it was for Great Britain back then. The questions are the same. What is our responsibility? Where is our humanity? Comparing the response of the 1930s to today reveals some troubling differences. The Kindertransport, for all its imperfections, was a moment of national generosity. The British government waived its visa rules, and the public opened their homes and their wallets. Today, refugee and asylum policies in many Western countries, including the UK, have become far more restrictive. We see stricter border controls, increased bureaucratic hurdles, and policies designed to deter people from seeking asylum. Measures like the UK's Nationality and Borders Act and its controversial Rwanda deportation policy stand in stark contrast to the spirit of the Kindertransport. There have been attempts to revive this spirit. Lord Alf Dubs, himself saved by the Kindertransport, championed an amendment in 2016 to create safe passage for a specified number of unaccompanied refugee children from Europe. While the Dubs Amendment was a noble effort, its scope was limited, and it ultimately fell short of its goal, showing how much political attitudes have shifted. The narrative has changed. In the 1930s, the children were seen primarily as victims needing rescue. Today, refugees are often portrayed in political discourse as a security threat or an economic burden, which erodes public compassion and political will. Yet, there are still reasons for hope. Grassroots organizations and ordinary citizens continue to advocate for more humane policies. Educational projects like theatre productions of my play or the Kindertransport Clothespin Project work to connect this history to the present day. They remind us of our capacity for compassion. The legacy of the Kindertransport is frequently invoked by activists and politicians like Lord Dubs to argue for the creation of safe and legal routes for today's child refugees. It serves as a moral benchmark, a high point of humanitarian action that we can and should strive to reach again. As we reflect on the Kindertransport from the vantage point of 2025, we are left with a difficult question. Has our society grown less compassionate? On the surface, the evidence seems to point to yes. In an age of greater global wealth and interconnectedness, we see nations building higher walls, both physical and administrative. The political language surrounding refugees is often one of fear and scarcity, focusing on the perceived costs of compassion rather than the moral obligation. The generous, open-hearted response that defined the Kindertransport feels like a distant memory, a product of a different time. It is easy to become cynical and conclude that our collective humanity has weakened. However, the issue is more complex. The world of the 1930s was not a golden age of compassion. The Kindertransport happened against a backdrop of widespread anti-Semitism and anti-immigrant sentiment. Many countries, including the United States, refused to relax their immigration quotas, shutting their doors to thousands of desperate Jewish families. The Kindertransport was the exception, not the rule. It succeeded not because of a universally compassionate society, but because a determined group of people fought for it and persuaded a government and a public to act. The challenges today are different, yet similar. Political polarization, economic anxiety, and the spread of misinformation create a climate of fear that makes humanitarian action difficult. The sheer scale of global displacement can feel overwhelming, leading to a sense of helplessness or compassion fatigue. It is not necessarily that individuals have become less kind, but that the systems and political structures we live in often discourage our better instincts. The debate has been framed as a choice between national interest and humanitarian duty, as if the two were mutually exclusive. The enduring legacy of the Kindertransport is its powerful reminder that this is a false choice. The 10,000 children saved by the mission grew up to enrich British society in countless ways. Nobel laureates like Walter Cohn, politicians like Lord Alf Dubs, and artists like Frank Auerbach are just a few examples. They prove that offering refuge is not a burden, but an investment in humanity. The lesson is not that people in the past were better than us. The lesson is that compassion is a choice. It is a choice we have to actively fight for, in our communities and in our politics, every single day. The light of the Kindertransport shows us the way. The question is whether we will choose to follow it.